Hello, I'm Dominic D. I'm a junior at St. Xavier University, and I'll be presenting Conceptualizing Social Groups for senior seminar. So I'll be dividing my presentation into these parts: my introduction, my theories, my methods, my analysis, and then my conclusion. So the first part is my introduction. So I chose social groups to research for my project, and I chose this because usually when we think of sociology, we think of the power dynamics that many theorists use with within like their conceptualization of social groups. Many different uh, theorists have their own sort of theory on how social groups interact and how they think that social groups are divided by. And it's interesting that they can do that, but I also wanted to see how regular lay people would be able to conceptualize social groups as well. So the focus of my study is to see how people would conceptualize society and whether their identity would affect how they conceptualize society as well. So I'm thinking what social groups that they were and how that identity would affect how they conceptualize social groups. So like what factors affect their views. So my main research question is how do people conceptualize social groups and what factors affect their different conceptualizations? So I will be going on to my theories section. For my like framework, my theories, um, the theories I'll be using to frame my research are like the three main theories that deal with oppressed groups. So queer theory, feminist theory, and critical race theory. I'll be going through each of them. So queer theory deals more with heteronormative ideas and how to challenge those, especially when it comes to the binary between male and female, and um, also like the hetero like heterosexuality as well, trying to question those ideas and why they are dominant ideas in our society. Feminist theory questions why females are put into the back burner of a lot of ideas when it comes to things like voter suppression, although that's not a bigger deal now. Um, the pay gap, and well, it's mostly the pay gap for right for now. That's the thing. That's the main thing that comes off. That's the main thing that comes off top of my head. And the last one is critical race theory, in which minority groups, when it comes to their racial identity and why they are so oppressed when it comes to their basic rights. And I would also be using an intersectional framework so that I can understand that each of these identities for people are they interact with each other in a way that sometimes we will never understand unless we are part of those intersectional unless we are in that intersection. That makes sense. So I also drew from theories in social psychology because this is social psychology studies how people uh, how social groups also interact on a more micro scale. So the first one I'll be talking about is social categorization theory. It is how people categorize the world into groups that they belong in and groups that they do not belong in. That's social categorization theory deals with that, and that's how people usually act, like, when it comes to like their innate ability, or at least that's what this theory presents. The next one is also social identity theory. So I this theory states that identity is defined heavily on the social groups that we identify with. So, for example, I'm Filipino. Um, I would that itself would heavily define who I am. It's not just like just some concept. It's also a part of me that affects me as a person and my identity. So I'll be going on to my methods section. So for the purposes of this research, I what's the word? I did an open-ended question interview with 8 questions and 10 participants between the ages of 18 to 22 and one 56-year-old, I think, female. Two of the participants were male, the rest were female, but four of the females were also were friends, were close friends. So I wanted to see if their their ideas of social groups would be different or similar because since they're so close or since they're in their own in group, they're in their own closer group. I want to see if that had any effect on how similar their views would be. So the questions I chose were about what's the first part of the questions I chose were what social groups they perceived. So those questions were basically around the lines of what social groups you would perceive and then what social groups they identified with and then how critical they were of their own social groups. So those went along the lines of how or what about your social group do you like and how they interact with other social groups, and also what about your social group do you not like and how they interact with other social groups. And then also I did what they would do in certain situations, and these were 3 questions that were based off of if they were to offend somebody in any way, so in terms of sexuality, gender, or race, what they would do if they would offend somebody, if um their close friend would offend somebody, and what they would do if a stranger would offend somebody. Now that component was I did not find that to be very when I analyzed the data, I did not find that to be very compelling, like those questions, but I did put that in there just because those were the questions that I did ask because I wanted to see if that would affect how their social group would act, but then I realized that that does not their own reactions to these situations would not be generalizable to their whole social group, the social groups that they perceived. So my hypotheses or my assumptions were that individuals who felt more part of their social group would not be critical of their social group because I felt like if they are a part of their social group, or no, if they think about their social group, that is a part of them and they don't want to be too critical about themselves. So I feel like they wouldn't be able to criticize themselves or their own social groups very much. So and wanted to I also kind of assumed that people who were identified had an identity with any type of privilege, that they would not acknowledge their privilege in their explanation of social groups. So for example, if the subject I'm interviewing is white, I feel like they would not they would be less likely to use race as their way to categorize social groups because they don't want to acknowledge. I feel like they would not want to acknowledge their privilege. And this goes down also for cisgendered and heterosexual people would be less likely to use sexuality or gender as a way to categorize social groups as well. And I also had that individuals would have more of the same race and their in group than their out group. So I did ask them when talking about their social groups. I did ask them if their social groups, their in group would be what their composition would be, their racial composition or the gender composition would be. And I predicted that they would have, like for example, a white person again, for example, would be having more white people in their in group than they would have white people in their out group. Let's just go again. So this is my analysis portion. So when it comes to how subjects identified social groups, I found that almost all respondents, that 6 out of the 10 respondents based their explanation of social groups around their own social groups. So they said, for example, one respondent said that they were Latino, so they would he would gravitate towards other Latinos in his social group. So he used Latino as one social categorization. He also used male as a categorization as well. He framed his explanation of social groups around his identity. I also found out, or also found the trend that those who did not frame their social groups, their explanation of social groups around their identity, were majored in psychology and sociology. Um, a female of 21 years old, she majors in psychology. Her first instinct was to think of the LGBTQ community and BLM. And another person used uh, the LGBTQ community as well as their frame of reference for social groups. When it comes in terms of differences in identifying social groups, students studying social sciences, it seems that students studying social sciences were open to using different categorizations than those studying physical sciences. So, for example, so for out of out of the 10, there were 4 students who used gender, race, and economics economic status as a categorization, whereas the other 6, they only used one dimension, as in like one of them used interest as point of interest as their categorization. One of them used religious groups, but they only used one type of categorization. They did not combine any types. I feel like this is because they're not very educated in the way that social groups are conceptualized in sociology and psychology and social sciences in general. But the other ones who studied social sciences were able to think of different types of categorization, such as race, gender, and socioeconomic status. One second. So, how critical subjects, in terms of how critical subjects were to their social groups, almost every respondent was only like not that they didn't criticize their social groups very much, but they did say that their social groups were accepting in one area, but also not accepting in another area. I found that to be a trend throughout everybody who answered that question. One respondent who identified as Vietnamese, she's 20 years old, criticized her ethnic group heavily because she felt ostracized from that social group and tried to disassociate with them. So I found that to be that to be supporting of my assumptions or my hypothesis. So I included this just because it was part of my interviews, that responses to social situations regarding social injustices. This was the part where I was asking them how would they respond to situations of offending another person in terms of them, a friend, or a stranger. And all of them showed empathy to the offended person, but the further away they were from themselves. So a close friend, they would criticize them, but a stranger, they were hesitant, most of them. Um, yeah, four out of the 10 were hesitant to interact with a stranger. So my conclusion, so my results were somewhat supportive of my hypothesis. Um, Individuals did feel who did identify with their social groups were less critical of their social groups, but one person who felt um like they were ostracized from the social group, they were like much more critical than the other respondents. Um, those who perceived race as a group were they all did. I didn't have any um white people who I interviewed, so I couldn't really measure that. And then perceived sexuality and gender, people who did perceive sexuality and gender were studied social sciences, so they understood it enough to where they could use that as a framework for their social conceptualizations. And all individuals usually had more of one group in their in-group proportionate to their out-group. So that's across the board, except for the Vietnamese uh, female. She had more Hispanics in her in-group than her out-group, but it was still the same uh, ethnic, no, racial group, rather than them all being Vietnamese. They were all, or not all, but most of them being uh, Hispanic, rather than most of them being Vietnamese. And so that will conclude my presentation.